Welcome to the next episode of Bones and Stones. Today we have Ghilraen Laue with us. She's from the KwaZulu-Natal Museum in Pietermaritzburg, probably colder than we all feeling up north today. Thanks very much for joining us, Ghilraen. And I think just to kick things off, you got your PhD at Rari. You were at Rari for some time. You then moved to the museum. Can you just tell us a bit about, well, maybe what you did at Rari, but then your transition into the museum?
So, yeah, I started off actually doing Stone Age archaeology, but rock art has always been my passion. So I went into working in the Rock Art Research Institute. I worked with the setup of the Origins Centre Museum. And in 2013, I started with my PhD. And it was actually while I was still busy with that, the job opportunity came at the museum and I applied. I have to say, before that, I'd never really thought about working in a museum environment. It had not really been anything on my radar. But when I got here, it's a perfect job. I really enjoy it. It has expanded my own work, and it's also given me a really nice opportunity to continue my research as well.
So one of the questions that came up on a previous episode was whether or not you need a PhD to go into the field that you're in. So being in a museum, obviously having a PhD, and as you said, it wasn't your intention to go into museums, but would you say that it's important to have a PhD for what you're doing, or is it not important?
Well, all of us in the curator positions do have PhDs, and I know that the adverts for the positions are normally with a master's at least, with the intention of doing a PhD. So it is expected, both in our department, which is the Human Sciences Department, and the Natural Sciences Department. Okay, cool.
And then just also, museums, I know you were telling me that the setup at your museum is slightly different than what's often found at museums. Can you sort of walk us through what your day-to-day activities, what you get up to, and what your main sort of tasks are?
Well, I don't actually have a good idea of what happens at other museums, but I think our research output is much higher, and there's a strong focus on research. So my main job here is actually to do my own research, and since we're a national museum, I can do it anywhere in the country. So my research area is actually in the Southern Cape near Port Elizabeth, and so writing papers and conducting field work is a very important part of the job. But as well as that, we also publish the Southern African Humanities Journal. So the curators here, the three, Gavin Whitelaw and Justine Winches and myself, we work on this publication. We are all editors of the journal, so that also takes up a lot of time. I find it really interesting. You get to see papers and have to read papers much more thoroughly from much more wide variety of aspects, because we deal with archaeology, anthropology, history, and material culture. So that takes up a lot of time. We also, as a museum, are expected to be involved with the public. So doing public lectures. I'm quite active in the KwaZulu-Natal branch of the Archaeology Society. To be involved in organizations like ASAPA, to take part in reviewing papers from other journals, external examination. Since we don't have students here, we do have the opportunity of working with any institutions in the country as co-supervisors. And then there's also obviously our collections, which is another big part of what I do here, is looking after them. So we have 4 major collections, which is our history collections, which is mostly European history, Victorian stuff from Pietermaritzburg and the surrounds, but also stuff from other parts of Africa and other parts of the world. Then we have our anthropology collection, which is very extensive, our archaeology. So a lot of the sites which have been excavated in KwaZulu-Natal, such as Sibudu, the material is housed here. plus people bring in things which have been found. So we have 2 floors of archaeology, and then we also have what we call our special collections, which is actually what I'm in charge of, which involves which is our firearm collection, a lot of the weapons, spears, that type of thing. Our paper copies, we have a huge collection of Patricia Vinnicum's original copies, and our photos and slide archives. And so those are my days. I don't work every day on all of those, but I normally split it up over the month to make sure that I'm doing some of that.
Okay.
Every month.
Cool. Kara, do you want to take it away with the question you've got?
Yeah, Ghilraen, thanks for joining us. And it sounds like it's a really interesting setup, and actually very cool because of the focus on archaeology. I think a lot of people sort of expect, museum employees to be sort of bogged down with a lot of administration and sort of museum display, cataloging of inventory and things like that. So it's quite interesting. Would you say, number one, that this is a preferable sort of position to a more traditional academic one in a university, just based upon the fact that, most of us are bogged down in terms of supervision, administration, teaching, and we don't have, as much, let's say, free time to do our own personal research?
I do think that I have a lot of freedom, both in terms of my research questions, the stuff I want to look at. But I remember when I was at the students did take up a lot of time. And I did enjoy working with students a lot, but it was also a relief in a way to be able to have that extra time to just sit down and do my own work. I can sometimes, for example, at the end of March, I had some papers due, and for 2 or 3 weeks, that's all I was working on. I didn't have to worry about distractions. You mentioned displays, so that's one thing that I didn't mention earlier. We are involved in displays in terms of the content. So the display department will actually put together the exhibitions, but when they're updating exhibitions or for new exhibitions, we do have an input on the content. So it's a little bit outside your question.
Cool. And then Lotte, you've got a question.
Yeah, thanks, Ghilraen. It's really interesting to hear about your kind of daily routines and stuff, and what you've been getting up to since you've been down there. Just to maybe backtrack a little bit, when you spoke about getting engaged with the community, and you spoke about being quite involved with the OXOC branch down there, are you quite connected with a lot of the schools in the local area, and are you dealing with young learners as well?
We have a lot of young learners coming to the museum, but that is the education department takes care of them, takes them around the museum. So our role is to educate the education department about the displays that are there. So I would take the educators on tours of the rock art exhibits, for example, in the museum. I've given them lectures on what they should know and what they should be giving to the learners. We do occasionally get requests from schools. Unfortunately, time is always an issue. So we've worked with some of the schools near where Gavin Whitelaw is doing his excavations. I've done some work at some of the schools in Durban, but it's not a huge part of my day-to-day life.
Okay. And then just to sort of branch off a little bit here, the research that you're doing in the Cape, is that an extension off of your PhD work? Is it linked to that, or is it a new study that you've launched?
No, it's linked to my PhD. So when I started my PhD, I've always been fascinated by areas of rock art which have been understudied, which haven't been a focus. So, for example, I looked for my honours, I worked in the Uniondale area. My master's, I went up into the Waterberg. And when I started my PhD, I realised that nobody had worked in the Southern Cape. Of all the sites, there are about 3 which have been found, they were published in some of the popular publications by Wilcox and Woodhouse, but no one had actually done any work there. And so for my PhD, I identified 37 new sites.
Wow.
But there are so many more, and I was lucky to be able to get into the field just before lockdown, and I got to record 3 new sites. But there is still so much more to do there, and I'm hoping to get back into the field. I have funding to continue research in the area for the next 3 years, and I estimate there's probably going to be over 100 sites, new sites, and really interesting things which are coming out.
So then, I mean, okay, so based at the museum, you doing your rock art research, what are the other archaeologists busy with, generally speaking, who are employed by the museum?
So Gavin Whitelaw, he does Iron Age. And so we're not all archaeologists. Our department is Department of Human Sciences. And so we're looking at anthropology and history as well. So Justine Winches comes from a history of art background. And then our director is Jeff Blundell, who also has a background in rock art. That's another thing which I think you have the opportunity to be more of a generalist working in a museum, because there are so few of us. In a university environment, you get a lot of specialization, whereas here, because we're working, you have to be more general. So I couldn't imagine a place, for example, for someone who is working only on faunal remains or only on archaeobotany. You know, those are the kind of things which if they came up in our project, we would outsource. But here we have to be able to look at a whole lot of different things. So even although my research is specifically on rock art and the rock art of the Southern Cape, at the moment we're always finding interesting things in the collection. And I recently was with Bernard Zipfel from the Evolutionary Studies Institute, and we found 2 naginata, which are Japanese martial arts weapons, and they were donated to the museum in 1905. And so we've been looking into doing a publication on those. We also have our firearms collection, which I'm also looking into doing a publication. It's been quite, it's expanded. So I actually brought it out here because I look after the firearms collection. I had to get I don't know if you can see these, my competency in handguns, shotguns, and rifles, and muzzle loaders. So obviously a lot of the firearms are really old.
Yeah.
So that's what I also love about it. There's so much. Every time I go and look in the collection, sometimes it's just because we have to, keep track of where things are. We do checks all the time. I'm always finding new things, and there is so much. And that's something which we've discussed. It would be lovely to actually bring in more students to work on our collections here, because there is so much.
Yeah, that's kind of sort of my angle with that question, is that it seems to be you get to play with a lot of fun stuff in a range of different fields, and yeah, it looks like a lot of fun most of the time. Matt, do you want to ask the last question?
Yeah, thanks, Ghilraen. I was going to say, going through museum collections is really interesting. I've had the opportunity of poking into some of the boxes at the base of the origins. And I mean, there's some amazing stuff there as well. You can get lost in there for hours just having a look what's there. But my question just comes back to your daily activities. Are any of the staff members or yourself responsible for conducting heritage surveys in the corporate sector? Does that form part of your purview?
So we do. We don't have any kind of CRM unit attached to the museum. We used to, but I've done one working with an external CRM management company, and I know Gavin Whitelaw has as well. So we're more on call if necessary, and the museum is quite happy for us to do that type of work if needed. But it's not part of our everyday duties. It's just as needed.
Well, I think that's been a really interesting insight into sort of life in a museum and what you get up to, and the kind of really enjoyable research freedoms that you seem to have, which is making all of us very jealous, I think. But thanks for that. It's really quite fascinating. And yeah, thanks again for joining us, Ghilraen, taking some time out of your day. And hopefully maybe we can have another chat and talk more specifically about your research as well at some stage.
Most definitely. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
That was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.